The year is 82 AD. The sun rises over Rome, painting the city's 7 hills in gold and blood. In the shadow of the Colosseum, a line of prisoners shuffles forward, their chains clinking softly against the ancient stones. Among them are women, some young, some old, all marked by the dust of distant provinces. They are captives, spoils of war, reminders of Rome's endless hunger. Today, they are not just prisoners, they are offerings. Inside the arena, the crowd is already gathering. Senators in white togas, merchants with gold rings, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, all eyes fixed on the sand below. The air is thick with anticipation, the kind that tastes of sweat and fear. Somewhere beneath the stands, gladiators prepare. Men who have killed and survived, men who have become legends and ghosts in equal measure. Their bodies are scarred, their eyes hard. But today, victory means more than survival. Today, victory means power. This is not the Rome of marble statues and philosophers. This is the Rome of spectacle, of blood and thunder, of secrets whispered behind closed doors. The games are not just entertainment. They are a ritual, a machine that grinds hope into dust and feeds the city's insatiable appetite for dominance. And at the heart of this machine are the gladiators, men who fight, men who win, men who are promised rewards that go far beyond gold. But what happens after the final blow is struck? What becomes of the women who survive the games, who are left standing when the sand settles and the crowd roars for more? History tells us little. The official records are silent, the chroniclers distracted by emperors and armies. But the truth is there, hidden in the margins, buried beneath centuries of shame and silence. To understand what really happened, you have to see Rome as it was, a city built on conquest, a society obsessed with power, a world where the line between victim and victor was as thin as a blade. The Colosseum was not just a stage for death, it was a crucible, a place where the boundaries of humanity were tested and broken. The women who entered the arena were not always warriors. Some were captured in distant wars, Asia, Britannia, Judea. Some were slaves, condemned for crimes real or imagined. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept up in the tides of empire. To the crowd, they were nameless, faceless, less than human. To the victors, they were prizes. Gladiators, for all their fame, were not free men. Most were slaves themselves, bought and trained for the sole purpose of violence. But victory in the arena brought privileges, money, fame, and, sometimes, the right to claim a prisoner as a personal reward. The crowd cheered for blood, but they also cheered for the spectacle that followed. The fate of the defeated was as much a part of the show as the fight itself. The rituals began the moment the games ended. The victors were paraded before the crowd, their weapons raised, their bodies gleaming with sweat and blood. The defeated men and women alike were dragged across the sand, their fates decided by the whims of the editor, the man who controlled the games. Sometimes, mercy was granted. More often, it was not. For female prisoners, the ordeal was just beginning. The crowd's appetite did not end with the final blow. In the private chambers beneath the arena, away from the eyes of the public, the real horror unfolded. Gladiators, drunk on victory and adrenaline, were given access to the prisoners. What happened in those rooms was rarely recorded, but the whispers have survived, stories of humiliation, of violence, of acts so brutal that even Rome, a city built on cruelty, tried to hide them. The official histories speak of rewards and privileges, of festivities held in honor of the victors. But the language is a mask, a way to sanitize what was, in truth, a system of exploitation. The women were not just spoils of war. They were tools, used to reinforce the power of the victors and the helplessness of the defeated. Their suffering was part of the spectacle, a secret performance that played out in the shadows of the greatest city on earth. But why did Rome hide these stories? Why did the chroniclers turn away? The poets fall silent. The records vanish. The answer lies in the nature of power. Rome was obsessed with control, not just over its enemies, but over its own image. The games were a symbol of Roman greatness, a testament to the city's strength and order. To admit the horrors that followed would be to admit a weakness, a crack in the marble facade. And so the truth was buried. The stories of the women who suffered at the hands of their conquerors were erased, their names forgotten, their pain dismissed as the price of empire. But the silence is not complete. In the letters of foreign diplomats, in the graffiti scratched into the walls of the Colosseum, in the half-remembered tales passed down through generations, the truth lingers, a shadow that refuses to fade. If you listen closely, you can still hear their voices, the women who walked into the arena, who faced death and survived, only to find that survival was not the end, but the beginning of a new kind of torment. Their stories are not just footnotes in the history of Rome. They are a testament to the darkness that lies at the heart of every empire, a reminder that power unchecked always seeks new victims. This is the story Rome tried to hide, but history has a way of revealing what was meant to be forgotten. And today, we remember not just the victors, but the vanquished. Not just the glory, but the horror. To truly grasp the fate of female prisoners in the aftermath of gladiatorial victory, you must first understand the world that created both the victors and the vanquished. Rome was a city obsessed with spectacle. But beneath the roar of the crowd and the gleam of armor, it was also a city of secrets. The Colosseum itself was a monument to this duality. its grand arches and marble seats a mask for the violence and humiliation that unfolded within. The games were more than entertainment. They were a tool of statecraft, a way for emperors and senators to display their power, to remind the people of Rome's might and the futility of resistance. Every drop of blood spilled in the arena was a message. This is what happens to those who defy the empire. But the message did not end with death. It continued in the treatment of the survivors, especially the women. For the gladiators, victory was a rare taste of agency in lives otherwise defined by servitude. Most were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, forced to fight for the amusement of others. But in the moment of triumph, they became something more: heroes, celebrities, objects of desire and fear. The crowd adored them, the elite courted them, and the women, both free and captive, were drawn into their orbit. Yet, for the female prisoners, the aftermath of the games was a descent into a different kind of arena, one without rules, without mercy, without witnesses. The rituals of reward were carefully orchestrated. After the games, the victors were led to private feasts, their tables laden with food and wine, their bodies tended by slaves. The female prisoners, stripped of their dignity and hope, were brought before them as living trophies. The language of the time is telling. In the writings of Juvenal and Martial, in the graffiti of Pompeii, women are described as spoils, gifts, offerings to the gods of victory. The implication is clear. Their fate was not their own. They were objects, symbols of conquest, reminders of the power wielded by those who survived the sand. Some were forced to serve at the feasts, pouring wine, entertaining the guests, their every movement watched and judged. Others were taken as personal property by the victors, their bodies a final reward for a fight well fought. The boundaries between ritual and reality blurred. What began as a public spectacle ended in private degradation. The stories that survive are fragmentary, glimpses into a world that preferred to look away. In a letter from a Roman matron to her daughter, preserved in the ruins of Herculaneum, there is a warning: do not look upon the games with envy, for the victors are not always merciful, and the vanquished are not always dead. In the writings of Seneca, there is a hint of unease. The true measure of a man is not how he wields the sword, but how he treats the defeated. But these voices were rare. Most Romans accepted the system as natural, even necessary. The suffering of the prisoners was the price of peace, the cost of empire. To question it was to question Rome itself. Yet, beneath the surface, there were cracks. The women who survived the games did not always submit quietly. Some resisted, fighting back in whatever ways they could, through silence, through prayer, through small acts of defiance. In the catacombs beneath the city, archaeologists have found crude carvings, names, prayers, curses etched into the stone by hands that trembled with fear and rage. These were the marks of women who refused to be erased, who clung to their identities even as the world tried to strip them away. The gladiators, too, were not always the monsters the crowd imagined. Some saw themselves in the prisoners, fellow victims of a system that devoured the weak. There are stories, whispered in the margins of history, of gladiators who spared their captives, who risked their own lives to protect those who had been offered to them. These acts of mercy were rare, but they mattered. They were a reminder that even in the heart of darkness, humanity could survive. But for most, the reality was far harsher. The victors, drunk on power and adrenaline, saw the prisoners as extensions of their own triumph. To possess a captive was to possess proof of victory, to assert dominance not just over an individual, but over an entire people. The rituals of humiliation were as much about the crowd as they were about the participants, a way to reinforce the social order, to remind everyone of their place. The aftermath of the games was a time of contradictions. The city celebrated its heroes, but it also hid its shame. The feasts and festivities were public, but the suffering of the prisoners was private, concealed behind closed doors and guarded gates. The official records are silent, but the truth lingers in the shadows, in the stories passed down by slaves, in the scars carried by survivors, in the ruins of a city that once called itself eternal. To walk the streets of Rome today is to walk on the bones of the forgotten. The Colosseum stands as a monument to glory, but also to horror. The sand that once drank the blood of the defeated now lies silent, but the echoes remain. The women who suffered in the aftermath of victory are not just ghosts. They are witnesses, their stories waiting to be heard. This is the horror Rome tried to hide. But history, like memory, is stubborn. It refuses to be silenced. And so we remember not just the games, but what came after. Not just the victors, but the vanquished. Not just the spectacle, but the suffering. The silence of the official records is not an accident. It is a choice, a deliberate act of forgetting. A way for Rome to preserve its image as the world's greatest civilization while hiding the rot at its core. But the truth, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. The fate of female prisoners after the games was not just a footnote. It was a reflection of the values that shaped an empire. To the Roman elite, The suffering of the defeated was a spectacle, a lesson in the consequences of defiance. The games themselves were designed to blur the line between entertainment and punishment, between justice and cruelty. The crowd cheered for the victors, but they also reveled in the humiliation of the vanquished. The more complete the domination, the greater the satisfaction. For the women who survived the arena, the ordeal was both physical and psychological. Stripped of their names, their histories, their dignity, they became symbols of Rome's power. Some were paraded through the streets, displayed as trophies in the triumphal processions that marked a general's victory. Others were forced into prostitution, their bodies sold to the highest bidder as a final act of conquest. The most fortunate were absorbed into the households of their captors, condemned to lives of servitude and silence. The rituals of humiliation were carefully choreographed. At the feasts that followed the games, the female prisoners were made to serve the victors, pouring wine, singing songs, performing dances that mocked their own defeat. The boundaries between celebration and degradation vanished. The crowd, sated by blood, demanded more proof of Rome's supremacy, more reminders of the price of resistance. Yet even in the heart of this darkness, there were moments of rebellion. Some women refused to play their assigned roles, choosing death over dishonor. In the writings of Pliny the Elder, there is a story of a Dacian woman who, when offered as a prize to a victorious gladiator, seized a shard of broken pottery and ended her own life rather than submit. Her act was condemned by the authorities, but whispered about in the slave quarters as a rare moment of defiance. The gladiators themselves were not immune to the contradictions of their world. For some, the power they wielded over the prisoners was intoxicating, a brief escape from their own powerlessness. For others, it was a source of shame, a reminder that victory in the arena did not erase the chains that bound them. In the graffiti of Pompeii, there are messages scratched by gladiators who mourned the women they were forced to claim, who saw in their suffering a mirror of their own. The machinery of erasure was relentless. The stories of the women who suffered after the games were buried beneath layers of myth and propaganda. The poets sang of Rome's glory. The historians chronicled the deeds of emperors and generals, but the voices of the vanquished were lost, only in the margins on the walls of the Colosseum, in the letters of foreign visitors, in the prayers whispered in the catacombs that the truth survived. The horror was not just in the acts themselves, but in the way they were normalized, woven into the fabric of daily life. That games were a public ritual, a shared experience that united the city in a celebration of violence. The suffering of the prisoners was part of the price of admission, a spectacle that reinforced the social order and reminded everyone of their place. But the silence was never complete. In the centuries that followed, as Rome's power waned and the empire crumbled, the stories of the women who suffered in the aftermath of victory began to resurface. In the writings of early Christian martyrs, in the legends of saints and sinners, in the folk tales passed down through generations, the truth emerged, the truth that Rome had tried and failed to erase. The legacy of the games is not just one of glory and triumph, it is a legacy of suffering, of voices silenced and lives destroyed. The Colosseum stands as a monument to both the greatness of Rome and the horror it tried to hide. To walk through its arches today is to feel the weight of history pressing down, to sense the presence of those who came before. The sand may be clean, the stones may be worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, but the echoes remain. The women who suffered in the aftermath of victory are not just ghosts. They are witnesses, their stories waiting to be heard. In the end, the question is not just what the gladiators did to the female prisoners, but what Rome did to itself. The city that prided itself on order and civilization built its greatness on a foundation of violence and exploitation. The games were a mirror, reflecting the darkest desires of a society that worshipped power above all else. The horror Rome tried to hide is not just a story of the past. It is a warning, a reminder that every empire, no matter how mighty, is built on the suffering of the powerless. The silence of the official records is a silence that demands to be broken. The stories of the vanquished are not just history. They are a call to remember, to bear witness, to refuse to let the darkness win. As the sun sets over the Colosseum, the shadows lengthen and the city grows quiet. But the voices of the forgotten do not fade. They linger, insistent, demanding to be heard. This is their story. This is the truth Rome tried to bury. Centuries have passed since the last games echoed through the Colosseum, but the questions remain. What does it mean to build a civilization on the bones of the conquered? What is left behind when the victors write the history and the vanquished are consigned to silence? The story of what Roman gladiators did to female prisoners after winning is not just a tale of ancient cruelty, it is a window into the soul of an empire, and perhaps into the soul of humanity itself. The machinery of spectacle that defined Rome was not unique to its time. Across the world and throughout history, the powerful have always found ways to turn suffering into entertainment, to transform the pain of the weak into a lesson for the strong. The Colosseum was simply the grandest stage for a drama that has played out in countless forms. The public execution, the slave market, the forced parade of the defeated. The faces change, the costumes shift, but the script remains the same. For the women who survived the games, survival was not a victory, it was a sentence. Their lives became a series of negotiations, small acts of resistance, moments of fleeting dignity, the hope that someone, somewhere, would remember their names. Some found ways to endure, to carve out spaces of safety in a world that offered none. Others disappeared, their stories lost to time, their suffering reduced to a line in a ledger or a rumor whispered in the dark. Yet, even in the depths of despair, there were moments of light. In the catacombs beneath Rome, archaeologists have found traces of secret gatherings, women who prayed together, who shared stories, who kept alive the memory of those who had fallen. In the margins of ancient manuscripts, there are notes written in a woman's hand, prayers for mercy, pleas for justice. These fragments are all that remain, but they are enough. They are proof that even in the heart of empire, the human spirit endures. The gladiators, too, left their mark. Some became legends, their names remembered long after their deaths. Others vanished, their stories swallowed by the very system that made them famous. But in the end, they were all prisoners of Rome, of the games, of the expectations that defined their lives. Their victories were fleeting, their rewards tainted by the suffering they inflicted and endured. Rome tried to hide the horror, to bury the truth beneath layers of myth and marble, but the past is never truly silent. The stones remember, the walls of the Colosseum, pitted and scarred, bear witness to the screams that once filled the air. The sand, though swept clean, still holds the memory of blood. The city itself is a palimpsest, a place where the stories of the powerful and the powerless are written over each other, again and again. Why does this story matter now? Because the machinery of spectacle is not dead. It has simply changed its form. The world still rewards the strong and punishes the weak. The stories of the vanquished are still at risk of being forgotten, their suffering dismissed as the price of progress. To remember what happened in Rome is to remember the cost of silence, the danger of forgetting. The women who suffered after the games are not just relics of a distant past, they are reminders of what happens when power is unchecked, when cruelty is normalized, when the suffering of the few is justified by the pleasure of the many. Their stories are a warning, a call to look beyond the spectacle, to see the humanity in those who are most easily ignored. In the end, the true horror Rome tried to hide was not just the violence of the games, but the indifference that followed. The willingness to look away, to accept the suffering of others as inevitable, to let the victors write the only story that matters. But history is not just the story of the powerful, it is also the story of those who endured, who resisted, who refused to be erased. As you walk through the ruins of the Colosseum, as you stand in the shadow of its arches, remember the women who walked there before you, remember the prisoners who survived the games, only to face a new kind of torment. Remember the voices that were silenced, the stories that were buried, the truths that were hidden. Because in the end, the light that survives is not the light of victory, but the light of memory. The light that refuses to be extinguished, even in the darkest of places. The light that says, we were here, we endured, we will not be forgotten. This is the story Rome tried to hide, but you have heard it now, and in remembering, you become part of the resistance against forgetting. The Colosseum stands as a monument not just to the power of empire, but to the resilience of those who suffered beneath its gaze. The sand may be silent, but the echoes remain. So the next time you hear the word gladiator, remember not just the roar of the crowd or the clash of swords, but the silence that followed, the silence filled with stories waiting to be told. The silence that is, in the end, more powerful than any empire, because history is not just what is written in stone. It is what survives in memory, in whispers, in the courage to face the truth. And sometimes, the greatest act of defiance is simply to remember.